At my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law forced me to transfer $75,000 in front of the family. When I refused, she kicked me and sneered that my husband never loved me. I walked away, and minutes later she learned why the family still calls me the boss.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
The mahogany casket gleamed under the funeral home's soft lighting, and I stood beside it feeling like I was drowning in a sea of black suits and whispered condolences. Harold had been gone for 3 days, and I still couldn't believe my husband of 35 years was lying there, so still and silent. The man who used to hum while making coffee every morning, who left little notes in my lunch bag even after decades of marriage, who called me his Maggie in that tender way that made me feel like a newlywed even at 62. People kept touching my shoulder, murmuring things like, "He's in a better place," and "You were such a devoted wife." I nodded and smiled, playing the part of the grieving widow they expected to see. But inside, I felt hollow, empty, like someone had scooped out everything that mattered and left just the shell behind. Mom Margaret, my son Thomas approached with Jessica trailing behind him. At 34, Thomas still had Harold's gentle eyes, but something in his face looked strained, tired. Jessica, on the other hand, looked perfectly put together as always. Her blonde hair was styled in an elegant updo, her black dress was clearly expensive, and her makeup was flawless. Even at a funeral, she managed to look like she was attending a business meeting. "How are you holding up?" Thomas asked, his voice soft with genuine concern. For a moment, I felt a flicker of warmth. Maybe my son still cared about me after all. But then Jessica stepped forward, her blue eyes cold and calculating. "Margaret, we need to talk about some practical matters. I know this isn't the ideal time, but there are things that can't wait." I frowned, confused. "What kind of things?" Jessica glanced around at the other mourners, then leaned closer. "Financial things. Harold left some debts that need immediate attention, and there are funeral expenses that haven't been covered yet." My chest tightened. Harold had always handled our finances, but I knew we weren't in debt. We lived modestly, saved carefully. "What debts?" Harold never mentioned any debts. "That's because men don't like to worry their wives with these details," Jessica said, her tone patronizing. "But Thomas and I have been going through the paperwork, and there's quite a bit that needs to be settled right away." Thomas looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Jessica, maybe we should discuss this later." "No, Thomas. Later might be too late." Jessica's voice grew sharper. "Margaret, we need you to transfer $75,000 to cover these immediate expenses. I have the bank transfer forms right here in my purse." I stared at her, my mouth falling open slightly. $75,000? "Jessica, I don't have that kind of money just sitting around." "Of course you do," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Harold had life insurance, and I'm sure you have savings. This is family business, Margaret. We all need to do our part." The funeral home suddenly felt too small, too warm. I could hear other family members talking quietly nearby, and I was acutely aware that our conversation was drawing attention. My sister Ruth kept glancing over from across the room, her eyebrows raised in concern. "I'm not comfortable making any financial decisions right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Harold just passed away. Can't this wait until after the funeral?" Jessica's expression hardened. "No, it can't wait. The creditors won't wait, Margaret. If you don't handle this now, it's going to affect Thomas and the children. Is that what you want?" I felt like I was being cornered, trapped between her demands and the watching eyes of my family. "Jessica, please. I need time to think about this. I need to understand what's going on." That's when she did something I never expected. Jessica grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. "Margaret, you're being selfish. Harold is dead, and you're already thinking only about yourself. These debts are real, and they need to be paid now." I tried to pull my arm free, but her grip tightened. "Jessica, you're hurting me. I'm trying to help you understand reality," she hissed, her voice low enough that only Thomas and I could hear. "You can't just ignore these responsibilities. Sign the transfer papers, or Thomas is going to lose everything." That's when I said no. The word came out stronger than I felt, but I meant it. "No, I won't sign anything today. This isn't appropriate. and I won't be pressured into making financial decisions at my husband's funeral." Jessica's face went white with rage. Before I could react, she drew back her foot and kicked me hard in the shin. The pain shot up my leg, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling. Several people nearby gasped and turned to stare. "You selfish old woman!" Jessica spat, her voice carrying across the room now. "Harold never loved you. He told me so himself. He said you were just someone he felt sorry for, someone he had to take care of out of obligation. And now you can't even honor his memory by taking care of his debts." The funeral home went dead silent. I could feel everyone staring at us, could see the shock on Thomas's face, the horror on my sister Ruth's face across the room. My chest felt like it was caving in. The words hit me harder than the kick had. Never loved me. Obligation. Harold. My Harold, who brought me flowers every Friday for 35 years, who held my hand through 3 miscarriages and celebrated when we finally had Thomas, who whispered, "I love you, Maggie," every single night before we went to sleep. According to Jessica, it had all been a lie. I looked at my son, waiting for him to say something, to defend me, to tell his wife she was out of line, but Thomas just stood there, his face pale, saying nothing. Without a word, I turned and walked away. I walked past the gasping relatives, past the funeral director who was hurrying over to see what the commotion was about, past the flowers and the guest book, and all the reminders that the only person who had ever really loved me was lying in that casket. I made it to my car before the tears started. My hands shook as I tried to get the key in the ignition, and I could barely see through the blur of my vision. But I heard something that made me pause. Through the open car window, I heard my cousin Patrick's voice, loud and clear. "That girl has no idea who she just messed with. Margaret might be quiet, but she's still the boss around here. Always has been." I sat in that parking lot for 10 minutes crying until I couldn't cry anymore. Then I drove home to the empty house where Harold and I had built our life together. I had no idea that in 3 days everything would change. I had no idea that Harold had seen this coming from miles away and had prepared for exactly this moment. I thought Jessica had destroyed me that day. I thought she had taken away not just my dignity, but the memory of my marriage, the belief that I had been loved. I went home believing I was nothing more than an obligation that Harold had carried for 35 years, but Harold had always been a planner. And even in death, he was still protecting me in ways I couldn't have imagined. 3 days after Harold's funeral, I was still in my pajamas at 2 in the afternoon. I hadn't eaten anything substantial since the funeral, just nibbled on casseroles that well-meaning neighbors had dropped off. The house felt different without Harold's presence. Too quiet, too empty, like a museum of memories I was no longer sure I could trust. Jessica's words kept echoing in my mind. "Harold never loved you. He told me so himself." Every time I looked at our wedding photos on the mantelpiece, every time I saw his coffee mug still sitting in the sink because I couldn't bear to wash it, I wondered if it had all been an elaborate act of kindness. Had my entire marriage been built on pity? I was sitting in Harold's recliner, clutching his favorite sweater and breathing in the faint scent of his cologne, when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. For 3 days, I'd been letting the answering machine take calls from people offering condolences I didn't feel ready to receive. But something made me pick up on the 4th ring. "Mrs. Morrison?" "This is James Patterson from Patterson, Wheeler & Associates. I was your husband's attorney." I frowned, confused. Harold had never mentioned having an attorney. We'd always handled our simple affairs ourselves. Our will was just a basic document we'd drawn up online years ago, leaving everything to each other, and then to Thomas. "I think you may have the wrong number," I said softly. "Harold didn't have an attorney. Mrs. Morrison, I understand your confusion, but I've been representing your husband for the past 15 years. He was very specific that I should contact you exactly 3 days after his funeral. Not before, not after. He said you would need time to process the funeral, but that waiting longer would be cruel." My heart started beating faster. This sounded like Harold. He was always thinking ahead, always planning. But an attorney for 15 years? What had he been planning that I knew nothing about? "I'm sorry, Mr. Patterson, but I don't understand. Harold and I didn't have any legal matters that would require—" "Mrs. Morrison," he interrupted gently, "I need you to come to my office today. There are some things about your husband's estate that we need to discuss immediately. Things that Harold specifically wanted you to know before anyone else in the family became aware of them. The word estate caught my attention. What estate? We lived modestly in our little 3-bedroom house. Harold worked as a supervisor at the manufacturing plant for 30 years before retiring. We had some savings, his pension, and the life insurance policy. Nothing that would require an attorney. Mr. Patterson, I appreciate your call, but I think there's been some mistake. Harold and I didn't have an estate. We weren't wealthy people. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Mr. Patterson spoke again, his voice was very gentle, almost careful. Mrs. Morrison, I think you're going to find that there were many things about your husband's financial situation that he kept private. He was very insistent that you be protected from certain knowledge until after his death. Can you come to my office at 4 o'clock today? It's very important. I looked down at my pajamas, at the tissues scattered around Harold's chair, at the general state of my life 3 days after losing my husband. The last thing I wanted to do was get dressed and drive across town to meet with some attorney about matters I didn't understand. But something in Mr. Patterson's voice made me agree. Maybe it was the way he said Harold had been planning this. Maybe it was the faint hope that there were still parts of my husband I could discover, pieces of him that Jessica couldn't touch with her cruel words. I'll be there at 4, I said. Patterson, Wheeler & Associates was located in one of the nicest office buildings downtown, the kind of place I'd driven past 1,000 times but never had reason to enter. The lobby was all marble and glass, with expensive-looking art on the walls, and a receptionist who looked like she belonged in a magazine. Mr. Patterson turned out to be a man about Harold's age, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a way of speaking that immediately put me at ease. His office was warm and comfortable, lined with law books and family photos that made it feel more personal than I'd expected. Mrs. Morrison, please sit down. Can I offer you some coffee? Water? I shook my head, my purse clutched tightly in my lap. I just want to understand why I'm here. What did Harold need an attorney for that he never told me about? Mr. Patterson opened a thick file folder on his desk. Your husband came to me in 2008, about a year after your son Thomas married Jessica. He said he was concerned about your daughter-in-law's intentions and wanted to make sure you would be protected if anything happened to him. My stomach dropped. Harold had been worried about Jessica from the beginning? I thought back to 2008, trying to remember if he'd ever said anything negative about her. But Harold was always so diplomatic, so careful not to interfere in Thomas's marriage. What kind of concerns? I asked quietly. He felt that Jessica married Thomas for financial reasons and that she had unrealistic expectations about your family's wealth. He was worried that if he died first, she would try to manipulate you or pressure you into giving her access to assets that he wanted to preserve for your security. I thought about Jessica's behavior at the funeral, her immediate demand for $75,000, her insistence that there were debts that needed to be paid right away. Had Harold somehow predicted exactly what would happen? Mr. Patterson, I appreciate that Harold was thinking of me, but we don't have significant assets. I'm not sure what he thought he was protecting. Mr. Patterson looked at me carefully, as if he was trying to gauge how much shock I could handle at once. Mrs. Morrison, what did Harold tell you about his work? He was a supervisor at Morrison Manufacturing. He worked there for 30 years before retiring. That's true, but it's not the complete picture. Mr. Patterson pulled out a document and slid it across the desk to me. Harold was also the majority shareholder of Morrison Manufacturing. He owned 67% of the company. I stared at the document, but the words seemed to swim on the page. That's impossible. Morrison Manufacturing is a huge company. They employ half the town. Your husband bought into the company gradually over his 30-year career. He started as a floor supervisor, but he was also investing every spare dollar he could into company stock. When the original owner wanted to retire, Harold arranged to buy him out. He's been the controlling owner for the past 12 years. My head was spinning. But we live so modestly. If Harold owned a manufacturing company, why were we clipping coupons and driving 10-year-old cars? Because Harold believed that displaying wealth would make you targets. He also wanted to make sure that anyone who came into your family's life loved you and Thomas for who you were, not for what you had. Mr. Patterson pulled out more documents. Mrs. Morrison, Morrison Manufacturing is just one of Harold's holdings. Over the years, he invested in commercial real estate, other local businesses, and various financial instruments. Your husband was worth approximately $12 million when he passed away. $12 million. The number was so absurd I almost laughed. 3 days ago, I'd been worried about whether I could afford to keep the house on Harold's pension and Social Security. Now this stranger was telling me I was worth $12 million. This has to be a mistake, I whispered. It's not a mistake. And Mrs. Morrison, there's something else you need to know. Harold was very specific about how his estate should be handled. He left detailed instructions about what should happen if anyone in the family tried to pressure you or manipulate you after his death. Mr. Patterson pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Harold's familiar handwriting. Harold wrote you a letter that he wanted me to give you only if certain conditions were met. Based on what happened at the funeral, I believe those conditions have been met. My hands trembled as I took the envelope. Inside was a letter written in Harold's careful script. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, it means that someone in our family has tried to hurt you or take advantage of you after my death. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this directly, but I hope what I'm about to tell you will give you the tools you need to protect yourself. I had to stop reading because my eyes were filling with tears. Harold had known. Somehow, he had known exactly what would happen, and he had prepared for it. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Patterson said gently, would you like me to explain the specifics of Harold's estate plan? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Harold has left everything to you, with one exception. Thomas will receive a trust fund that provides him with $50,000 per year, but only if he treats you with respect and maintains a relationship with you. If he allows anyone to mistreat you or if he participates in pressuring you for money, the trust fund is revoked. And Jessica? Jessica receives nothing, unless she can prove that she has treated you with kindness and respect for a period of no less than 2 years. Harold was very clear that he didn't trust her motives. I sat back in the chair, overwhelmed. My quiet, gentle husband had been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. He had seen Jessica's true nature from the beginning and had spent years building a fortress around me. There's one more thing, Mr. Patterson said. Harold left instructions about Morrison Manufacturing. You now own the company, Mrs. Morrison. Jessica works in their accounting department. The irony was so perfect I almost laughed through my tears. Jessica, who had kicked me and told me I was worthless, who had demanded money from me like I was a burden on the family, was now my employee. For the first time since Harold's funeral, I felt something other than grief and confusion. I felt the stirring of something that might have been power. I drove home from Mr. Patterson's office in a daze, Harold's letter clutched in my purse and my mind reeling from everything I'd learned. $12 million. Owner of Morrison Manufacturing. Jessica working for me without even knowing it. It felt like I'd stepped into someone else's life. Someone much more important and powerful than the quiet widow I'd believed myself to be. That evening, I sat at our kitchen table, my kitchen table now, and read Harold's letter completely for the first time. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, it means that someone in our family has tried to hurt you or take advantage of you after my death. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this directly, but I hope what I'm about to tell you will give you the tools you need to protect yourself. I've been watching Jessica carefully since she married Thomas, and I'm afraid my instincts about her were correct. She married our son because she believed we had money, and she's been disappointed to discover that we live so modestly. I've heard her make comments to Thomas about his inheritance and about how we should be helping them more financially. The truth is, Maggie, we do have money, more than Jessica could ever imagine. But I've kept this from everyone, including you, to protect our family from people who might try to take advantage of us. I've been building wealth quietly for years, always putting everything in your name so that no one could claim it belonged to anyone else. You own Morrison Manufacturing, my love. You own the building where Thomas's insurance office is located. You own the shopping center where Jessica gets her nails done. You own rental properties throughout the county. You are, in fact, one of the wealthiest women in our town, and you always have been. I just never told you because I wanted you to be safe. If someone has pressured you for money or tried to make you feel worthless, I want you to know that you have options. You have power. Use it wisely, but don't let anyone walk over you ever again. I love you more than life itself, Maggie. You were never an obligation. You were my joy, my partner, my everything. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Your devoted husband, Harold. I must have read that letter 10 times before the words really sank in. Harold hadn't just loved me. He had spent our entire marriage secretly building an empire with me as the Empress. Every modest decision, every coupon clipped, every careful purchase had been part of a larger plan to protect me. The next morning, I called Mr. Patterson and asked him to walk me through Harold's holdings in detail. What he showed me took my breath away. Morrison Manufacturing was just the beginning. Harold owned the Morrison Plaza Shopping Center, a sprawling complex that housed 30 businesses including Jessica's nail salon, the grocery store where I shopped, and the restaurant where Thomas liked to take clients. He owned 12 rental properties throughout the county, all managed by a property management company so that tenants never knew who their actual landlord was. Most surprising of all, Harold owned the building that housed Thomas's insurance agency. My son had been paying rent to me for the past 5 years without knowing it. Harold structured everything very carefully, Mr. Patterson explained as we went through file after file of documents. He used holding companies and trusts to keep his name off most public records. Even the property management company doesn't know who the ultimate owner is. They send all reports and payments to my office, and I've been managing everything according to Harold's instructions. How is that possible? How could he hide so much money? Your husband was very intelligent about financial matters, Mrs. Morrison. He understood that wealth creates its own problems, especially when family is involved. He wanted to make sure that you could live a normal life without constant pressure from people who might want something from you. I thought about all the times over the years when money had been tight, or when I'd worried about unexpected expenses. Harold had always managed to find a solution, a small bonus from work, or a good deal on whatever we needed. Now I realized he'd been drawing from this hidden wealth all along, but in such small amounts that I never suspected. Mrs. Morrison, there's something else you should know. Harold left very specific instructions about what should happen if family members mistreated you after his death. Mr. Patterson pulled out another folder. He anticipated that Jessica might try to pressure you for money, and he wanted to make sure you had leverage to protect yourself. What kind of leverage? Well, for example, Jessica works at Morrison Manufacturing in the accounting department. She makes $68,000 a year. Harold left instructions that if she treated you poorly, you should feel free to make changes to her employment situation. The idea of having power over Jessica felt strange and a little frightening. I'd never been the type of person to use my position to hurt others, but I remembered the kick she'd given me, the cruel words about Harold never loving me, and I felt a flicker of something that might have been righteous anger. What about Thomas? Does he know about any of this? Thomas knows nothing about your financial situation. Harold felt it was important that his relationship with you be based on love, not on expectations of inheritance. The trust fund Thomas will receive is substantial, but it comes with conditions that require him to treat you with respect. I left Mr. Patterson's office with a briefcase full of documents and a new understanding of my life. I wasn't the helpless widow Jessica thought she could manipulate. I wasn't the burden on my family that her cruel words had made me believe I was. I was Margaret Morrison, and I owned half the town. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I drove to Morrison Manufacturing and asked to speak with the manager. The plant was exactly as I remembered it from the few times I'd visited Harold at work over the years. A large, busy facility with the constant hum of machinery and the smell of industrial lubricants. But now, looking at it with new eyes, I could see it differently. This wasn't just where Harold worked, this was what he had built. Mrs. Morrison, the plant manager, Robert Sullivan, hurried over when he saw me in the lobby. I'm so sorry for your loss. Harold was a wonderful man and a great boss. Boss. The word hit me strangely. Thank you, Robert. I'm still trying to understand everything about Harold's business interests. Robert's expression shifted slightly, becoming more formal. Of course, ma'am. Mr. Patterson called ahead and explained that you'd be taking over Harold's responsibilities. We're prepared to brief you on all operations whenever you're ready. I appreciate that. But first, I'd like to see Jessica Winter's employment file. Robert looked surprised. Jessica in accounting. Of course, but may I ask why? Family matters, I said simply. Jessica's file made for interesting reading. She'd been hired 3 years ago, shortly after marrying Thomas. Her resume claimed extensive experience in accounting, but her actual performance reviews were mediocre at best. She'd received several warnings about accuracy issues and attitude problems with coworkers. Most interesting was a note from her supervisor about Jessica's frequent comments regarding her family connections to the company. Apparently, she'd been telling people that she expected to be promoted quickly because her father-in-law was important at Morrison Manufacturing. Has Jessica's work been satisfactory? I asked Robert. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. To be honest, Mrs. Morrison, we've had some concerns. Jessica seems to feel that her family connection entitles her to special treatment. She's been pushing for a promotion to department supervisor, but her work quality doesn't really justify it. I see. And what would happen if her work quality didn't improve? Well, normally we'd put someone on a performance improvement plan. If that didn't work, we'd have to consider other options. I nodded thoughtfully. I think Jessica might benefit from some additional training and closer supervision. Could you arrange that? Of course, Mrs. Morrison. Should I tell her that the changes are coming from you? No, I said. Let's keep this between us for now. As I drove home, I thought about the power I now held. Jessica had kicked me, humiliated me, told me I was worthless and unloved. She had no idea that her victim was now her boss, that her financial security depended entirely on the woman she'd treated so cruelly. But I also thought about Harold's letter, about his reminder to use this power wisely. I didn't want to become vindictive or cruel. I just wanted Jessica to understand that actions have consequences, and that the quiet widow she'd dismissed so easily was not as powerless as she appeared. That evening, Thomas called to check on me. His voice was careful, concerned, like he was talking to someone fragile who might break at any moment. Mom, how are you doing? I've been worried about you since the funeral. I'm managing, I said. It's been an adjustment, learning about all the things Harold handled that I never knew about. What kind of things? I smiled to myself. Oh, just business matters, financial things. It turns out your father was more involved in the community than I realized. Well, if you need help with anything, just let me know. Jessica and I are here for you. Jessica and I. Even now, even after what she'd done at the funeral, Thomas was still grouping them together as a unit. It made me sad, but it also strengthened my resolve. Maybe it was time for Jessica to learn some lessons about respect and consequences. 2 weeks after my meeting with Mr. Patterson, I began what I thought of as my education in being wealthy. It was harder than I'd expected. For 35 years, I'd lived modestly, carefully, always thinking twice before making any significant purchase. Now I was learning that I could afford almost anything I wanted, but the habits of a lifetime were difficult to break. More challenging was learning to use the power that Harold had left me. I wasn't naturally vindictive, and part of me felt guilty about what I was planning. But every time I started to soften, I remembered Jessica's kick, her cruel words, the way she'd tried to manipulate me at my husband's funeral when I was at my most vulnerable. My first step was subtle. I called Robert Sullivan at Morrison Manufacturing and asked him to implement some new policies that would affect Jessica's work environment. I want all accounting department employees to start logging their time more carefully, I told him. And I think we need to be more strict about personal phone calls and internet usage during work hours. Of course, Mrs. Morrison. Any particular reason for the change? Just good business practices, I said. I also think we should review everyone's performance more frequently. Monthly reviews instead of annual ones. What I didn't tell Robert was that I'd been doing some research into Jessica's daily routine. Through the property management company that Harold had used, I'd learned quite a bit about the tenants in Morrison Plaza. Jessica spent her lunch hours getting her nails done at polished perfection, often taking longer than her allotted break time. She frequently used the company phone to make personal calls, and according to her supervisor's notes, she spent significant time on social media during work hours. The new policies wouldn't single Jessica out directly, but they would make her life considerably more difficult. The second change was more direct. I owned the building where Thomas had his insurance agency, and Harold had been charging him below market rent as a way to help our son get established in business. The lease was up for renewal next month. I called the property management company and instructed them to raise Thomas's rent to market rate. It wasn't unreasonable. He'd been paying 30% below what other similar spaces rented for, but it would mean an additional $1,800 per month in expenses for Thomas's business. Should I mention who authorized the increase? The property manager asked. No, just explain that the owner has decided to bring all rents up to current market rates. My third move involved Jessica's beloved nail salon. Polished Perfection had been struggling financially. I could see this from the reports the property management company sent me. They were frequently late with their rent, and their lease included a clause that allowed me to terminate for repeated late payments. I instructed the property management company to begin enforcement procedures. Nothing dramatic, just formal notices about late rent and reminders about lease compliance. But it would create stress and uncertainty for the salon owner, which would likely translate into higher prices or reduced services for customers like Jessica. The changes began taking effect within days. Thomas called me, sounding stressed. Mom, something weird is happening with my office lease. The rent is going up by $1,800 a month. I can't figure out why. I've been a good tenant, always paid on time. That does sound unusual, I said sympathetically. Have you tried negotiating with the landlord? That's the strange thing. Nobody seems to know who the actual landlord is. The property management company says they're just following orders from the owner, but they won't tell me who that is. I made appropriate, sympathetic noises while feeling a flicker of satisfaction. Let Thomas worry about money for a while. Let him see what it felt like to face unexpected financial pressure. A few days later, I got an even more satisfying phone call. This time it was Jessica herself, though she didn't know she was calling her boss. Margaret, it's Jessica. I hope you're doing well. Her tone was completely different from the last time we'd spoken. Sweet, concerned, almost syrupy. It was such a contrast to her behavior at the funeral that I had to bite back a sarcastic comment. Hello, Jessica. I'm managing. I'm so glad to hear that. Listen, I wanted to apologize if I seemed a little stressed at Harold's funeral. It was such an emotional day for all of us, and I think the grief just overwhelmed me. Interesting. She was calling it grief now instead of anger about imaginary debts. I understand it was difficult for everyone. Yes, exactly. And Margaret, I hope you know that Thomas and I are here for you. We're family, and family takes care of each other. I wondered what had prompted this sudden change in attitude. That's very kind of you to say. Actually, that's why I'm calling. Thomas and I are going through a bit of a rough patch financially. His office rent just went up unexpectedly, and my work situation has become more demanding lately. I was wondering if you might be able to help us out with a small loan. Just $5,000 to get us through the next few months. There it was. Jessica was still trying to get money from me, just with a different approach. Instead of demands and cruelty, now she was using manipulation and fake sweetness. $5,000 is a lot of money, Jessica. I know, and I wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate, but I promise we'll pay you back as soon as things stabilize. And Margaret, I want you to know how sorry I am if I said anything hurtful at the funeral. I was just so worried about Thomas and the children. The children. She was using my grandchildren now, the two little ones I barely got to see because Jessica always found excuses to keep them away from me. I'll need to think about it, I said. Of course. Take all the time you need. But Margaret, I hope you know that we love you and we want you to be part of our lives. Maybe you could come over for dinner this weekend? The kids would love to see their grandma. After I hung up, I sat in Harold's chair and tried to process what had just happened. Jessica's complete change in attitude was fascinating and disgusting at the same time. When she thought I was powerless, she kicked me and told me I was worthless. Now that she needed something from me, suddenly I was beloved family who should be included in dinners and visits with the grandchildren. It told me everything I needed to know about Jessica's character. She didn't feel genuine remorse for hurting me. She was just recalibrating her approach based on what she thought would work. That weekend, I did go to dinner at Thomas and Jessica's house. It was my first visit there since Harold's death, and I was curious to see how Jessica would behave now that she was trying to manipulate me with kindness instead of cruelty. The house was impressive, a large colonial in one of the better neighborhoods, with expensive furniture and decorations that definitely exceeded what Thomas could afford on his insurance agency income. I wondered how much of this lifestyle had been subsidized by Harold's below-market rent and other quiet assistance over the years. Jessica was the picture of a devoted daughter-in-law. She hugged me at the door, complimented my dress, asked how I was adjusting to life without Harold. She served my favorite foods I was surprised she remembered, and made sure my wine glass was never empty. The children, 5-year-old Emma and 7-year-old Michael, were delighted to see me. It had been months since I'd spent any real time with them, and I realized how much I'd missed them. Jessica had been very good at finding reasons why visits weren't convenient. "Grandma Margaret, look what I can do." "What?" Emma performed an elaborate cartwheel in the living room, beaming when I applauded. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You've gotten so good at gymnastics. Mommy says we might not be able to afford gymnastics lessons much longer because money is tight," Michael said matter-of-factly. Jessica's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Michael, sweetie, why don't you show Grandma the picture you drew at school?" But the comment had been made, and I understood its purpose. Jessica was using the children as leverage, making sure I knew that my financial help would directly benefit my grandchildren. Throughout dinner, Jessica kept steering the conversation toward their financial struggles. Thomas's rent increase, her demanding new supervisor at work who was making her life difficult, the possibility that they might have to cut back on activities for the children. "It's just temporary," Jessica said with a brave smile. "We'll get through it. Family always does, right, Margaret?" I smiled and nodded and played the role of the sympathetic grandmother, but inside I was taking notes. Jessica's performance was masterful. She'd managed to present herself as both vulnerable and noble, a devoted mother willing to sacrifice for her children, a loving daughter-in-law who only wanted what was best for the family. It was exactly the opposite of the woman who had kicked me at Harold's funeral. As I drove home that evening, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The satisfaction came from seeing Jessica struggle, from watching her scramble to deal with the financial pressures I was creating. She deserved to feel some stress after what she'd put me through, but the sadness came from seeing how easily she could manipulate people when she needed to, how quickly she could shift from cruelty to sweetness when it served her purposes. It made me wonder how long she'd been manipulating Thomas and whether my son had any idea who he'd really married. I also realized that my silent revenge was working, but it wasn't enough. Jessica was adapting to the pressure, finding new ways to get what she wanted. If I really wanted her to understand the consequences of her actions, I was going to have to be more direct. It was time for Jessica to learn exactly who she had been dealing with all along. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the dinner at Thomas's house. I was in Harold's old office, my office now, reviewing property management reports when Jessica called, and this time there was no pretense of sweetness in her voice. "Margaret, we need to talk. Something is going wrong, and I think you might be able to help us figure out what it is." "What kind of something?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea. "Everything is falling apart at once. My job at Morrison Manufacturing has become impossible. They're monitoring everything I do like I'm some kind of criminal. The nail salon where I've been going for 3 years suddenly can't fit me in for appointments. Thomas's rent went up again. Another $800 this month. It's like someone is targeting our family." I listened to the frustration in her voice and felt a cold satisfaction. "That does sound difficult. Margaret, I know this might sound paranoid, but I keep thinking about what happened at Harold's funeral. You left so upset, and I've been worried that maybe you took some of the things I said the wrong way. The wrong way. As if there was a right way to interpret being kicked and told that my husband never loved me." "What things, Jessica?" "You know, about Harold and the debts. I was just so stressed about the financial situation, and sometimes when people are grieving, they say things they don't really mean." Now she was trying to rewrite history, to make it seem like her cruelty had been grief-induced rather than calculated manipulation. I remember what you said quite clearly, Jessica. That's what I'm worried about. Margaret, I need you to know that I was wrong. Harold did love you. Anyone could see that. And there were no debts. I was just confused about some paperwork Thomas had been looking at. It was fascinating to watch her scramble, to see how quickly she was willing to admit her lies when she needed something from me. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm scared, Margaret. I think someone is trying to hurt our family, and I don't know why. The only thing I can think of is that maybe I made enemies when I was trying to handle Harold's affairs after the funeral. Maybe someone misunderstood my intentions. Jessica was grasping at straws, trying to find some explanation for why her comfortable life was suddenly becoming difficult. She had no idea that the someone she was afraid of was sitting on the other end of the phone line. Have you talked to Thomas about this? That's another problem. Thomas is becoming distant. He's stressed about money, and he keeps asking me questions about things I said at the funeral. He's starting to blame me for our problems, and I don't understand why. That was interesting. Maybe my son was finally starting to see his wife's true nature. Jessica, I appreciate you calling to clear the air about the funeral, but I'm not sure how I can help with your other problems. Margaret, please. I know I hurt your feelings, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But we're family, and I need to know that we can count on each other. Could you maybe loan us the money we talked about? Just enough to get through this rough patch? There it was again. No matter what crisis Jessica was facing, her solution was always to ask someone else for money. How much money are we talking about now? Maybe 15,000? I know it's more than I mentioned before, but things have gotten worse. Thomas's business is struggling with the increased rent, and I'm worried about my job security at Morrison. $15,000. 3 times what she'd originally asked for, and this time delivered without any of the fake sweetness she'd used before. Jessica was getting desperate. That's a significant amount of money, Jessica. I know, and I promise we'll pay it back. Margaret, I need you to understand something. I love Thomas, and I love those children more than anything in the world. Whatever mistakes I've made, I'm just trying to protect my family. The irony was perfect. Jessica was talking about protecting her family from the very person she had attacked and humiliated. She still had no idea that I was the source of all her problems. I'll consider it, I said. But Jessica, I need to know that this kind of financial crisis won't happen again. I need to understand what's really going on with your job and Thomas's business. My job. Margaret, I think there might be something personal behind the problems at Morrison Manufacturing. My supervisor has become incredibly demanding, and they've implemented all these new monitoring policies that seem designed to make my life difficult. It feels targeted. If only she knew how targeted it really was. Have you considered that maybe your work performance needs improvement? There was a long pause. Excuse me? Well, if they're monitoring you more closely, maybe there were issues with your work that needed to be addressed. Margaret, I've been an excellent employee. I've never had any problems at Morrison before this. That wasn't true, according to the performance reviews I'd seen, but I didn't correct her. And what about Thomas's situation? Has he tried to negotiate with his landlord? The landlord won't even meet with him. Everything goes through this property management company, and they won't say who the actual owner is. It's like whoever owns that building wants to stay anonymous while they squeeze every dollar they can out of their tenants. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. She was describing me perfectly without realizing it. Maybe Thomas should consider moving his office to a more affordable location. He's been in that building for 5 years, Margaret. He's established there. All his clients know where to find him. Moving would be devastating for his business. Sometimes change is necessary, even when it's difficult. Another long pause. When Jessica spoke again, her voice was colder. Margaret, I get the feeling that you're not taking our situation seriously. We're talking about your son's livelihood, your grandchildren's future. Don't you care about what happens to us? And there it was. The real Jessica beginning to emerge again. When sweetness and manipulation didn't work, she fell back on guilt and accusations. Of course I care about Thomas and the children, but not about me. Jessica, you kicked me at my husband's funeral and told me he never loved me. You tried to extort $75,000 from me when I was grieving. Forgive me if I'm not entirely sympathetic to your current difficulties." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Jessica spoke, and her voice was shaking with anger. "So this is about revenge. You're the one behind everything that's happening to us." "I'm not sure what you mean. Don't lie to me, Margaret. Somehow you're connected to Morrison Manufacturing and Thomas's building and all the other problems we're having. You're using your money to hurt us." It was interesting that she assumed I had money to use. Just a few weeks ago, she'd thought I was a poor widow who should be grateful for any attention from the family. "Jessica, I think you're under a lot of stress, and it's making you paranoid." "I'm not paranoid. I know you're behind this. The question is how. Harold was just a factory supervisor. Where did you get the kind of money and connections it would take to manipulate our lives like this?" I could hear the desperation in her voice now, the fear of someone who was finally realizing that the person she'd dismissed and mistreated might not be as powerless as she'd believed. "Harold worked very hard for 30 years, Jessica. He was good at his job. Good enough to own the company where I work? Good enough to own Thomas's building?" So she was putting the pieces together. I wasn't entirely surprised. Jessica might be cruel and manipulative, but she wasn't stupid. "Those are some serious accusations, Jessica." "They're not accusations, they're facts. And Margaret, if you think you can destroy my family to get back at me for one bad day at a funeral, you're wrong. I'll fight you. I'll expose whatever you're doing. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. And what kind of person am I? You're vindictive and petty. You're using your dead husband's money to hurt innocent people because your feelings got hurt. Innocent people." She was calling herself innocent after everything she'd done. "Jessica, I think this conversation has run its course. If you're having financial difficulties, I suggest you and Thomas figure out solutions together. That's what married couples do." "This isn't over, Margaret. I know what you're doing now, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." After she hung up, I sat in Harold's chair and processed what had just happened. Jessica had finally figured out that I was behind her problems, but she still didn't understand the full extent of what she was dealing with. She thought I was just a vindictive widow with some money to throw around. She had no idea that I owned half the town, or that her entire lifestyle had been built on Harold's generosity, or that I could make her life infinitely more difficult if I chose to. But more importantly, she'd just threatened me. She'd promised to fight me and expose me, to make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. That changed things. Up until now, I'd been content with subtle pressure, with creating difficulties that would teach Jessica some lessons about consequences. But if she wanted to escalate this into open warfare, I was prepared to show her exactly what she was up against. It was time for Jessica to learn the full truth about who she'd been dealing with all along. Jessica's threat to expose me turned out to be exactly the catalyst I needed. Within 2 days of our confrontation, she had called Thomas, my sister Ruth, and several other family members, spinning a story about how I was using Harold's life insurance money to manipulate and hurt their family out of spite. The problem with Jessica's version of events was that she still fundamentally misunderstood what she was dealing with. She thought I had some money and connections. She had no idea about the true scope of Harold's empire or my position in the community. Thomas called me on Thursday evening, his voice strained and confused. "Mom, Jessica told me something that I'm having trouble believing. She says you're behind all our financial problems lately. My rent increases, her job issues, everything. She thinks you're using Dad's life insurance to hurt us." I could hear the conflict in his voice. Part of him didn't want to believe his wife's accusations against his mother, but part of him was desperate to find some explanation for why their comfortable life had suddenly become so difficult. "What do you think, Thomas?" "I don't know what to think. Jessica says you've been lying about having money, that you've been pretending to be poor while secretly controlling things behind the scenes. But Mom, that doesn't sound like you at all. What would you say if I told you Jessica was right about some of that?" There was a long silence. "What do you mean?" "I mean that your father left me more comfortable than I let on. And I mean that some of the financial pressures you've been experiencing are related to decisions I've made." "Mom, what are you saying?" I'm saying that maybe it's time you and I had an honest conversation about your father's estate and about what happened at his funeral. We arranged to meet for lunch the next day, just the two of us. I chose a restaurant in Morrison Plaza, one of the properties I owned, though Thomas didn't know that yet. I wanted to have this conversation on my territory. Thomas arrived looking tired and worried. At 34, he still reminded me of the little boy who used to climb into my lap with scraped knees, but there were new lines around his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that spoke of adult concerns. Mom, before we start, I need you to know that whatever Jessica might have said or done at Dad's funeral, she's still my wife. She's the mother of my children. I can't just abandon her. I admired his loyalty, even if it was misplaced. I understand that, Thomas. I'm not asking you to abandon anyone. Then what is this about? I pulled out a manila folder, just a small portion of the documents Mr. Patterson had given me, but enough to begin Thomas's education about his inheritance. This is about your father's estate and about some things he kept private to protect our family. Thomas opened the folder and began reading. I watched his face change as he processed the first document, the ownership papers for Morrison Manufacturing. This says Dad owned Morrison Manufacturing. That can't be right. It's right. He was the majority shareholder for the past 12 years. Thomas flipped through more pages, his expression growing more confused and amazed with each document. The ownership papers for Morrison Plaza, the rental property portfolios, the investment accounts, the trust fund that had been established in his name. Mom, this says your worth. He stopped, apparently unable to say the number out loud. $12 million. Yes, $12 million. He set the papers down and stared at me. Mom, how is this possible? We lived so modestly. We clipped coupons. You drove that old Honda until it practically fell apart. Your father wanted to protect our family from people who might try to take advantage of us. He also wanted to make sure that anyone who came into our lives loved us for who we were, not for what we had. Thomas was quiet for a long time, absorbing this information. So when Jessica married me, she had no idea about any of this. Neither did you. And the problems we've been having lately, my rent, her job, are consequences of how Jessica treated me at your father's funeral. I told Thomas everything then. About Jessica's demand for $75,000. About her kick and her cruel words about Harold never loving me. About my discovery of Harold's estate plan and the conditions he'd placed on Thomas's inheritance. She kicked you? Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper. In front of the entire family. And she told me that Harold never loved me, that I was just an obligation he felt sorry for. Thomas closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there were tears. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have said something. I should have defended you. Why didn't you? Because, he struggled with the words, because Jessica had convinced me that you were being difficult about Dad's affairs. She said there were debts that needed to be handled immediately, and that you were being stubborn and emotional about dealing with them. She made it sound like she was trying to help, and you believed her. I wanted to believe her. It was easier than thinking that my wife would lie to me or hurt you deliberately. I reached across the table and took my son's hand. Thomas, your father left you a substantial trust fund, but it comes with conditions. You have to maintain a respectful relationship with me, and you can't allow anyone to mistreat me or pressure me for money. What happens if I don't meet those conditions? Then the trust fund is revoked, and that money goes to charity instead. Thomas was quiet for a long time. What about Jessica? What did Dad leave her? Nothing, unless she can prove that she's treated me with kindness and respect for at least 2 years. 2 years. Thomas laughed bitterly. She failed that test in the first week. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the magnitude of what had been revealed. Finally, Thomas spoke again. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course. Are you going to use this power to destroy my marriage? It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with myself. I don't want to destroy your marriage, Thomas, but I also won't tolerate being treated the way Jessica treated me at your father's funeral. What do you want from her? I want a genuine apology, not the manipulative nonsense she tried to feed me when she wanted money. but real acknowledgement of what she did and genuine remorse for it. And if she gives you that, then we can discuss what comes next. But Thomas, you need to understand that the woman you married showed me her true character that day. She was willing to kick a grieving widow and tell her that her dead husband never loved her, all to get money she had no right to ask for. Thomas nodded slowly. I've been seeing signs of that side of her for a while now. I just didn't want to admit it. What kind of signs? The way she talks about people she considers beneath her. The way she treats service workers, or people she thinks can't do anything for her. She's always been good at managing how she appears to people who matter, but when she thinks no one important is watching. It broke my heart to hear Thomas finally admitting what I'd suspected for years, that Jessica was not the woman she pretended to be. What are you going to do? I asked. I don't know. I love her, Mom, or at least, I love the person I thought she was, but I have 2 children to think about, and I can't have them growing up thinking it's acceptable to treat people the way Jessica treated you. That evening, Thomas went home and confronted Jessica with what he'd learned. I know this because Jessica called me at 11 o'clock that night, and for the first time since Harold's funeral, I heard genuine fear in her voice. Margaret, please. Thomas is talking about divorce. He's talking about taking the children. Please don't let this destroy our family. Jessica, you tried to destroy this family when you kicked me at Harold's funeral. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was wrong about everything. I didn't understand who you were or what Harold meant to you. I was just scared about money, and I lashed out at you because I didn't know what else to do. For the first time, she sounded like she might be telling the truth. There was no manipulation in her voice, no calculation, just raw desperation. What exactly are you sorry for, Jessica? I'm sorry for kicking you. I'm sorry for trying to take your money. I'm sorry for saying that Harold didn't love you when anyone could see that he adored you. I'm sorry for treating you like you didn't matter when you're the most important person in Thomas's life. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. And what have you learned from all this? I've learned that actions have consequences. I've learned that the person I dismissed as a powerless old widow is actually one of the most influential people in this town. I've learned that I married into a family that I never took the time to understand or respect. And if I gave you a second chance, what would you do differently? Everything. I would treat you with the respect you deserve. I would make sure Emma and Michael know their grandmother and love her the way Thomas does. I would never, ever ask you for money again. I would try to earn back your trust and Thomas's trust. I believed her, not because I thought Jessica had suddenly become a different person, but because she finally understood the consequences of her actions. She'd learned that I wasn't powerless, and that treating people cruelly could come back to haunt her in ways she never expected. Jessica, I'm willing to give you one chance to prove you mean what you're saying. But if you ever treat me with disrespect again, if you ever try to manipulate me or use my grandchildren as leverage, this conversation will be over permanently. I understand. Margaret, thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance to make this right. 6 months later, Jessica had proven that people really can change when the stakes are high enough. She never asked me for money. She included me in family gatherings, and actually seemed to enjoy my company. She made sure the children spent time with me and developed real relationships with their grandmother. Most importantly, she treated me with genuine respect, not the fake deference of someone who wanted something from me, but the real respect of someone who had learned a valuable lesson about how to treat others. Harold had been right to protect me with his careful estate planning. But more than that, he had given me something I'd never had before: the power to demand the respect I deserved. Jessica's cruelty at his funeral had revealed her true character, but it had also revealed mine. I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, and I was no longer willing to be invisible or dismissed. As I sat in Harold's chair, my chair now, looking out at the town where I owned half the businesses, I thought about how much had changed since that terrible day at the funeral. I was still the same person who clipped coupons and drove modest cars, but I was also Margaret Morrison, one of the wealthiest women in town, and no one would ever kick me or dismiss me again. Harold had protected me even in death, and I had learned to protect myself. It was exactly what he would have wanted.